It's my sincere pleasure to introduce my friend William Lee Miller. Professor Miller is the scholar of ethics and institutions at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. He received his PhD from Yale in religious studies and social ethics. His work in ethical studies has contributed significantly to our understanding of America's cultural moral character. His first book, arguing about slavery, eventually led him to the world of Lincoln. His Ethical Lincoln is a wonderful look at the ethical underpinning of Abraham Lincoln. His new book, President Lincoln, The Duty of a Statesman, looks at the presidency. Professor Miller, we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you for having me again at this distinguished symposium. I believe this is the third time I've been privileged to appear, and I welcome it every time. It's an excellent, excellent audience each time. Let me begin with an introductory historical coincidence. I picture a supporter of a senator from New York, an odds-on favorite to win a party's presidential nomination, sputtering in exasperation at the upstart from Illinois who suddenly appeared to be stealing the nomination. Who is this guy? What has he done? He's a talker, not a doer. In the run-up to the party convention, the New York senator had seemed inevitable. But then came this Illinois speechmaker gathering up delegates. The New York senator would be ready to be president from day one. The New York senator could pass, you could almost give it antiphonally, the commander-in-chief test. The New York senator has experience. And the Illinois challenger, he's made a speech. What experience does he have? The New York senator has more than 35 years' experience as a lawyer for fugitive slaves, governor of New York, senator from New York, leader first of the Whigs and then the Republicans nationally. This novice has never held any high office. He'd never been in command of anything except a straggling company of volunteers in the state militia when he was 23, a group who, it was reported, when he issued his first command, told him to go to hell. He'd served 6 years in the Illinois state legislature. His only service in national government had been one short and unimpressive term as congressman 11 years earlier. He'd not been the executive of anything more than a two-man law firm. He'd never in his life fired anyone. He'd emerged on the national scene just by making speeches. The New York senator's supporter might grant, with a touch of condescension, that the Illinois threat delivered a good speech. But although that address at Cooper Union might be beautifully expressed and passionately felt, it was not, I put this in quotes, this is derived from, you can figure out where it came from. It was not action. Words are not actions. What we have to do is to translate talk into reality. A supporter of the more experienced man might have argued that the presidency is no place for on-the-job training, and he might have said nominating that Illinois fellow would be a roll of the dice. Nevertheless, the Republicans in 1860 did not do too badly when they did nominate, in spite of his alleged experience, the eloquent speaker from Illinois. It's the end of the historical coincidence. I started out studying Lincoln by writing about the Second Inaugural, the greatest of all speeches. Next, I went through the collected works and checked off the Union soldiers sentenced to be shot to death with musketry, whose life Lincoln saved with his pardons. I even planned a book to be called Lincoln's Mercy, which would have dealt with Lincoln's extraordinary use of the pardon power. I discovered that Edwin Stanton had treated Lincoln disdainfully in the 1855 Reaper trial, and then in his early presidential days had called him an imbecile and a guerrilla. But that Lincoln nevertheless overlooked all that and appointed Stanton to be his great Secretary of War. I wrote a chapter about Lincoln being, as his friend Leonard Swett said, a very poor hater. And I gave a talk at this symposium 6 years ago with that title. I noted that in spite of his role in a world of ambition, conflict, and power, Lincoln did not hold grudges. I talked about the remarkable absence of hatred or vindictiveness in this war leader. In his career, the word amnesty was not a term of reproach. Magnanimity, generosity, charity. After one talk of this sort at the University of Virginia Center, with which I'm affiliated, a former government official who'd heard me more than once came up afterwards and said, as though I were omitting something, "You always present the benign Lincoln." That gave me pause. Another experience had perhaps something of the same effect. On the turbulent day when a memorial to Abraham Lincoln was dedicated in Richmond, which is a story in itself, 3 of us gave talks in the morning at the Virginia Historical Association. Mine, once again, was about the magnanimous Lincoln. A conservative writer for the Weekly Standard, who was covering the furor over the monument, heard us talk. That evening, when Richmond's leading Lincoln-hating neo-Confederate asked the conservative writer what we'd said about Lincoln, the conservative writer answered, "They said Lincoln was a wimp." The neo-Confederate's sneering response was, "Jesus, even I don't think he was a wimp." Well, I don't think he was a wimp either. I say he was so far from being a wimp, he did not have to do or say macho things in order to avoid being called one. But I do admit that my presentations of Lincoln, with his magnanimity as the central trait, although true and in the end perhaps most important, nevertheless told only part of the Lincoln story. When I started to write about Lincoln as president, I could not help but see the centrality of another attribute, his implacable resolve. He did his duty as a statesman, and that certainly required the unbenign assertion of purpose, the unwimpish, determined use of coercive force, the willingness to undertake a long list of bold irregularities. I had invented for the earlier book the category and the subtitle, An Ethical Biography. The new book is an extension of that ethical biography into the unique moral situation of a President of the United States. The title of the earlier book had been Lincoln's Virtues. Michael Burlingame, disguised in my introduction as an anonymous wit, said that my next book should be called Lincoln's Vices. I offer instead President Lincoln, the Duty of a Statesman. Lincoln's moral situation was radically transformed at noon on March 4th, 1861. That morning, arising in the Willard Hotel at 14th and Pennsylvania, he had been a private citizen, an individual moral agent. That afternoon, Standing on the steps of the east portico of the Capitol before 30,000 fellow citizens, he had become an oath-bound head of state. He had been transformed by the constitutional alchemy into the executive of the federal government of the United States, the position that the framers in Philadelphia 74 years before had decided to call by the word president. There abruptly settled upon his elongated frame a profound new responsibility, obligating, constraining, and empowering him. Others would point to the immense power that in that moment came into his hands. He would point instead to the constraining duty which was antecedent to the power and the reason for the power. Next January 20th, a new person will take the constitutionally prescribed oath as president, the 44th president. And the moment when he or she takes the oath may be saturated in symbolism. Nevertheless, that moment will not have the existential immediacy it had for Lincoln, because in his case, the nation he was swearing to preserve, protect, and defend was literally and immediately in need of preservation, protection, and defense. The tableau on the Capitol steps that day made quite a tidy capsule of American history. There's Chief Justice Roger Taney, who had been the author of the Dred Scott decision, saying that black persons had no rights, administering the oath to Abraham Lincoln, who would write the Emancipation Proclamation, the first step toward a biracial nation. Taney thought the oath he was administering to Lincoln prohibited this executive from coercing states to remain in the Union. Lincoln thought that the oath administered to him by Taney required him to do so. Then came day one. We hear a lot now about day one. Well, Abraham Lincoln had a day one that makes the day ones of other presidents seem like a day at the beach. Lincoln was slapped in the face the first business minute of his presidency by the necessity of a decision of the gravest importance. There was no red telephone, and the call did not come at 3 in the morning, but he had the equivalent of that 3 in the morning phone call almost before he was seated at his desk in the letter from Fort Sumter. Abraham Lincoln achieved a new level of poetic eloquence with the mystic chords and better angels in his last paragraph on March 4th. But he would need something beyond eloquence on March 5th. He had made a good speech on Monday, but no speech would solve his quandary on Tuesday. If you had known Lincoln in Illinois before he became president, you would not have been surprised that he made good speeches. You knew that he was a good political organizer, and you would have known that he could overlook slights to himself and be forbearing and generous. But what you could not have known, what Lincoln himself did not know, was whether he could make the huge decisions of a nation in crisis. Did he have, to use the phrase of a future Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, the stuff of command? Of course, as a novice, what he should do was to consult the experts. His military chief was the great old General Winfield Scott. He gave the obvious advice: abandon the fort. His chief civilian advisor, his sometimes rival, now Secretary of State, William Seward, gave the same advice: by all means, abandon Fort Sumter. But this new president, for all his inexperience, found in himself somehow the gumption to say no. He admitted that militarily abandoning Sumter was plainly indicated. But he said politically it would be a disaster. He said no, and he kept on saying no. Lincoln lived 1,000 years between the inauguration and the fall of Fort Sumter. In the midst of that intensity, he devised a masterful action that brought a united North opposing the rebellion. The first requirement of moral decision for a statesman, actually for anybody, is to define the situation accurately. Accurately as to facts, accurately as to values. A modern interpretation of the classical virtue of prudence describes an essential quality. He alone can do good who knows what things are like and what their situation is. Realization of the good presupposes that our actions are appropriate to the real situation. We therefore take this concrete reality seriously with clear-eyed objectivity. Lincoln saw with clear-eyed objectivity the reality that he faced, a clear, flagrant, and gigantic rebellion that placed the nation's very existence in peril. For him, a rebel victory would not be just the graceful exit of the erring sisters. It would be our national destruction consummated. When one looks through Lincoln's presidential utterances about the effect of a successful slave state rebellion, one is impressed to find how many different terms he used and how stark and how dire they are. Immediate dissolution, the surrender of the existence of government, go to pieces, broken up, fall into ruin, the early destruction of our national union, abandon, overthrow, not survive, perish from the earth. And one asks what entity it is that would be destroyed, dissolved, broken up, overthrown. The answer is variously and interchangeably the Union, the government, the nation. And for whom would that be a disaster? Not just for the United States, but for the whole family of man. If the rebellion succeeded in the United States, that would show not just that the United States had failed, but would show the whole world that Republican government did not work. In this war, we are testing whether not just this nation, but any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. So what qualities would make Lincoln a great and good statesman? In the first place, his moral clarity and profundity. He'd taken the ideal claims of the American founding with equality at its center and internalized them. In the second place, his decisive action upon that definition. He did not dither, procrastinate, evade responsibility, or pass the buck, but made decisions, took responsibility, and acted. One shortcoming of Lincoln's predecessor, James Buchanan, was his understanding of the situation, his misunderstanding. He thought the entire national predicament was caused by abolitionist agitation. If they would just, in effect, he said, shut up, all would be well. But a second shortcoming was his dithering. When confronted with the rebellion in 7 states after Lincoln's election in November, although he properly said that no state had a right to secede, he nevertheless then covered over any response with a blanket of hesitations. Seward had given a witty summary of President Buchanan's position as expressed in his speeches in the midwinter. I think the President has conclusively proved 2 things, said Seward of Buchanan. First, that no state has the right to secede from the Union unless it wishes to. And second, that it is the President's duty to enforce the laws unless somebody opposes him. That would not be Lincoln's position. Where Buchanan sought avoidance and found restriction and therefore excuse, this new president would accept responsibility and find necessity and therefore empowerment. Altogether new to the highest level of national decision-making, indeed to executive responsibility of any kind, wearied by the pressure of reporters and visiting politicians in Springfield, and by an exacting trip from Springfield to Washington, embarrassed by a dark of night skulking entrance into the capital city, exhausted by 10 crowded pre-inauguration days in the Willard Hotel, stunned by an altogether unexpected bombshell of a message in his first minute of his presidency, harassed at every working hour and some non-working hours by long lines of office seekers outside his door, the novice President Abraham Lincoln gathered himself across the days of March and the first weeks of April to make the weightiest turning point decisions in the history of the American Republic since the founding. He proved to have, to the surprise of some, what Seward would call executive skill. He could take strong action forthrightly, as he would do to keep Maryland in the Union. But he could exercise sensitive restraint and shrewdness, as he would do in keeping Kentucky in the Union. He supported a virtual coup d'etat to keep Missouri in the Union. He pushed the edge of propriety to support the chopping off of a piece of Virginia to add a new Union-supporting state. Lincoln was only 4.5 months into his role as president when, on the night of July 21, 1861, it fell to him to cope with the grim news of a wholly unexpected, humiliating, and devastating defeat. John Nicolay would write many years later that the defeat was inexpressibly bitter because it was not only the first experience of defeat, but the first recognition of even the possibility of defeat. Walt Whitman would write in Specimen Days about Lincoln's response to Bull Run, "Whatever returns, a night like this can never again return." The president, recovering himself, begins that very night, sternly, rapidly sets about the task of reorganizing his forces. In many dark days in the 4 years that followed, he would go on to show the further virtue of a worthy statesman, a steadfast resolve. In one dark moment in the summer of 1862, he would produce this sentence, remarkable alike for its moral rigor, its literary grace, and its lawyerly covering of all contingencies. "I expect to maintain this contest until successful, or till I die, or am conquered, or my term expires, or Congress or the country forsakes me." After 2 more years of war, with the public clamoring for peace, Lincoln said, "We accepted this war for an object, a worthy object, and the war will end when that object is attained." The totally unwimpish Lincoln described his momentous decisions and the moral ground for them. "It became necessary for me to choose whether, using only the existing means which Congress had provided, I should let the government fall at once into ruin, or whether, availing myself of the broader powers conferred by the Constitution in cases of insurrection, I would make an effort to save it with all its blessings for the present age and for posterity." American presidents and presidential aspirants do like to quote Lincoln, refer to Lincoln, make visits to the Lincoln Memorial now, do anything short of growing a beard and standing on tippy-toe to hint that they have some connection to the greatest of presidents. This is especially true of war presidents, presidents inclined to the imperial presidency. But there are decisive dissimilarities. Lincoln himself made a distinction about being strong-willed and staying the course. It depends upon what you are strong-willed about and the wisdom of the course you are staying. In his eulogy of his first political hero, Henry Clay, in 1852, Lincoln said that Clay had an indomitable will. But Clay, Lincoln said, had also good judgment. And he added, without that good judgment, an indomitable will can be nothing but useless obstinacy. Lincoln's situation differed from that of all other presidents, does it not, in these three ways. First, the threat Lincoln faced was unique. No other president has faced the mortal threat to the very existence of the nation. Second, the emergency he dealt with, an insurrection, is explicitly recognized in the Constitution, along with an invasion, as a condition in which the public safety may require extraordinary measures. No president since 1865 has faced such an emergency. And third, Lincoln did not claim to have a presidential authority going beyond that of Congress. Lincoln would say his actions were ventured upon what appears to be a public demand and public necessity, trusting that Congress would ratify them. And Congress did. When you measure Lincoln on your wimpometer, the area goes way over to the strong side. And yet, Lincoln's strength of will is not like that of the strong men one imagines to be admired by those who sneer at so-called wimps. Lincoln's strong, purposive action did not feature assertive, overt assertion of a proud ego or the swaggering joy in dominating. Lincoln's resolution and strength of will did not spring from or lead to mindless stubbornness or egotistical willfulness. Lincoln's high resolve arose rather from the response of a rigorously dutiful intellect to a moral imperative found in the objective situation. A strong resolve was of great importance, but only as it rested on the stability of truth. That grounding in reason and duty, rather than ego, meant that Lincoln could be resolute without being ruthless. I have a little side debate with those who use the word ruthless about Lincoln. I say it doesn't apply if you look up what it means. He could exercise great power without fulfilling Lord Acton's dictum. He could combine generosity with his steadfast resolve. Because it rested on reason and the stability of truth, Lincoln's strength of purpose included the ability to admit that he was wrong, to confess mistakes and to learn from them, as he would do in his remarkable letters to generals, for example, particularly to Grant. In this book, I tell the seldom told story of the missent warship, the USS Powhatan, in the early days, which was a royal screw-up that was partly Lincoln's own fault. But he took the blame for it more than he deserved. He learned from it, and he did not repeat it. Reading along in historian Mark Neely, writing about Lincoln as commander, I come upon this sentence. Lincoln had demonstrated from the start a quality not easily squared with his kind and forgiving nature. He possessed an instinct for the jugular. Although at the primary level they seem to stand in sharp contrast, something not easily squared, deep charity, and let us say, relentless coercive action, at a deeper level, in Lincoln, they had ultimately a common root. Both qualities arise from a moral imagination that sees the vast and enduring consequences for weal and for woe which are to result from the struggle. When Lincoln uses the word vast, you can imagine him imagining the reach of all that he was doing. What I deal with, he famously said, is too vast for malicious dealing, but is also too vast to leave any card unplayed in the preservation of the United States. The boldness of Lincoln's boldest act, his decision to use the war power to free the slaves in the rebel states, is sometimes not recognized by modern readers. Paradoxically, the Emancipation Proclamation was a moral accomplishment that required that Lincoln not admit that it was a moral accomplishment. The Emancipation Proclamation turned the Union armies into armies of liberation, encouraged acts of self-liberation by slaves, transformed the war into a war for human rights, and ended the threat of recognition of the Confederacy abroad. Its symbolic significance completely outran its technical application. Rarely in history can there have been a document whose moral reach so far exceeded its legal grasp. Lincoln recognized the strictest duty to freed slaves, particularly to the black men who served in the Union Armed Services. If they stake their lives for us, he said, they must be prompted by the strongest motive, even the promise of freedom, and the promise being made must be kept. The sacred trust of that promise to the black soldier would run all the way through the rest of his presidency. To betray it would be a treachery, a cruel and astounding breach of faith, deserving the curses of heaven. In his last 1864 message, he made it a personal vow. If the people should, by whatever mode or means, make it an executive duty to re-enslave persons, then another, and not I, must be their instrument to perform it. No one is to be returned to slavery. If such treachery, such a cruel breach of faith is to be done, get somebody else, not me. The great short speech that Lincoln gave at his second appearing, as he called it, was the greatest expression of the golden thread of magnanimity that is woven throughout the whole of his presidency and his life. Here was a war leader rounding the corner into victory who expressed not a trace of triumphalism, not a word of moral vindication, not a hint of blame, who, although he insists that slavery is somehow, in quotation marks, somehow the cause of the war, wonderful somehow, he makes clear the complicity of the whole nation of North and South in the grave offense of slavery. But the Second Inaugural is not only a message of magnanimity and healing, it is also the firmest iteration of the moral purpose of his statecraft, now set in profound religious terms. In the great last paragraph, actually one long, beautifully controlled sentence, that begins with charity for all and malice toward none, the core of the sentence, which all the other clauses modify, is this: let us strive on to finish the work we are in. Charity, yes. Malice, no. But also finish the work. And in the stunning next to last paragraph, the passage beginning, fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. There is not only the stark invocation of the justice of God against slavery and a revulsion against the war, but also the most somber determination to finish that war and end that great evil. Lincoln wrote many condemnations of slavery, but none so stark as the moral condemnation implied in the dramatic picture, drop of blood for drop of blood, that sets up the affirmation at the end of that great paragraph, the severe piety of an acceptance of the whole terrible mixture, no matter what. Even if there should be so dreadful a woe sent upon the whole nation for the offense of slavery, still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. I begin this new book with mild comedy of the sometime backwoods rail splitter of Little Pigeon Creek, Indiana, suddenly finding himself sending greetings to his great good friend, Her Majesty Queen Victoria, and to his great good friend, His Royal Majesty Francis Joseph, Emperor of Austria, and to his great good friend, His Imperial Majesty Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, none of whom, of course, he had ever met. Messages drafted, to be sure, in the State Department, and composed in diplomatic formulae of the utmost insincerity, compared to which United States senators calling each other distinguished is a beacon of truthfulness. Nevertheless, these letters were signed by Abraham Lincoln, your obedient servant, your great good friend, Abraham Lincoln. And then the book ends with the more somber tragicomedy, when those majesties suddenly must respond to the death of this strange leader the Americans had chosen. If the world's rulers did not know quite what to make of this unlikely American head of state, they did know what to say about the shooting of a head of state. This act was execrable, horrid, vile, cowardly, abhorrent, brutal, deplorable, despicable, atrocious, criminal, and odious. But their faltering effort then to say something particular about the individual man himself who was shot was overwhelmed by the burst of grief all round the world from the common people. As Nicolay and Hay would put it, Lincoln was canonized as he lay on his bier by the irresistible decree of countless millions. Thank you.
You want to go to the microphones in the aisles if you have questions? Did he so overwhelm you that you're speechless or questionless? Oh, here we go. Here comes the... Well, I guess...
I think there are people going to the restroom.
Well, if you don't have... Oh, here we go. There we got two people coming up.
I hate
Go
to be
ahead.
the first, but from where did Lincoln's moral rigor come? Is it in the genes? Is it by his intellect? His father didn't express that. Where does it spring from?
That is a question one gets asked. You can imagine, writing the kind of stuff I do, I get asked that all the time. And you don't get a satisfactory, partly, there's something in the nature of the man. It's nature and culture. But something right from the start. The descriptions of him when young was a conscientious young man. Secondly, it isn't his father. The natural mother is a figure we don't know much about, but that would have been important. But it isn't institutional, really. It's print. Just to exaggerate, perhaps, but here's this ambitious young man who discovers that he has a good mind, a memory better than his father's or those around him, and a logical powers. Don't forget that about Lincoln. But he also has it tied to conscience somehow, and he reads. So he reads everything he can put his hands on. And I say in the earlier book, benign deprivation. There was a lot of the junk that we're surrounded by now he wasn't surrounded by, because the books that made their way out to Spencer County, Indiana, tended to be pretty good things. There was a King James Bible. There were readers with Addison and Steele and 19th century essayists. And Lincoln tended to internalize that stuff. He took it seriously, I think. And he also, of course, read about the American nation. He had this really romantic idea of the founders and the American nation, and the teachings of how a person ought to behave, plus the teachings about what this America stands for, internalized, made this extraordinary moral man. That's the best I can do.
In comparison, you have, people have compared Lincoln to, let's say, the Kennedy people because of the ability to want to do something versus actually getting it done. Now, it's fairly easy to, let's say, come out with, let's say, the Emancipation Proclamation, but to actually, once the war had started, or stopped rather, how would Lincoln, if Lincoln was still around, how would he actually have put into place when both sides really were still against each other? In other words, how would he actually have, let's say, worked let's say, slaves back into the system, as well as working, let's say, the South back into the system, so that this Emancipation Proclamation actually occurred versus just being a statement?
One can't know the answer to what would Lincoln have done had he lived. I have somewhere in the book a quotation from Frederick Douglass that for colored persons, as he put it, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln was an unspeakable catastrophe. And I say, for the whole country, it was an unspeakable catastrophe. We can say what his values would have been had he lived on to try to manage this difficult situation of getting the nation back together with the defeated white South back with the North, but also bringing the freedman up into full participation in the nation. And that's, of course, where we flunked, where we failed, where we had the lost 100 years. It would not have been a lost 100 years because Lincoln had this. You read the stuff, the things he says to Frederick Douglass, referred to this morning with Bill Harris, and his meetings with Douglass, his efforts to get slaves out where they could be with the Union Army, plus his determination about those who are freed, that would have continued on into further into Reconstruction, a commitment to the making of citizens out of the freed slaves. But how it would have worked exactly, I can't say. Sometimes you have to resort to this. People ask you, what would Lincoln do about this? What would Lincoln do about that? In contemporary terms, I'm reminded of Don Fehrenbacher in the height of the battle about busing and busing for racial balance. Somebody asked in a meeting, what would Lincoln say about busing? And Fehrenbacher paused a while, and then he said, well, he would say, what's a bus?
Yes, sir. Lincoln, born in Kentucky, the movement of his family in North and West, was that for opportunity, or was that because slavery may have played a role in? I don't know. I just want to hear what your answer is.
Well, I would yield to all the persons of greater knowledge, Michael Burlingame and others. They usually say it was partly because of slavery, partly because of problems about land tenure in Kentucky, getting straight the owning of property, that Thomas Lincoln made the decision to move up into Spencer County. But the Baptist church of which they were members was an anti-slavery, so there was a little bit perhaps of anti-slavery motive as well.
Thank you.
Professor, I've searched in vain in the Constitution for any explicit statement that the President can do whatever is necessary in wartime to preserve the nation. And I'm unaware that the question even arose in two preceding wars after the Constitution was written, that is, in the War of 1812 or of 1846. Was it a generally accepted interpretation of the Constitution in 1862 that Lincoln relied on, or did he ask specifically for a written interpretation from his Attorney General, or how did he arrive at those war powers?
That's a very good question. And I think the answer to the first part is no, it hadn't been spelled out explicitly in the previous wars. It had a different shape. This was a profoundly different one. He did emphasize, as I said in my talk, this war differs from the previous ones and all the subsequent ones as well, in that it was an emergency of a type. The Constitution does recognize, although in an indirect way, in the provision about suspending habeas corpus, it says, except in case of invasion or insurrection when the public safety may require it. Lincoln read that, I mean, there it is. It's explicitly in the Constitution, which is saying there are emergency situations when emergency actions, such as, I mean, he would then go on beyond the habeas corpus issue. But that at least is written in the Constitution. And then the other things. He is made Commander-in-Chief. But that's about all I think I can say. The public response in the early days, certainly, and everything that's indicated from Congress does retroactively adopt what Lincoln does. So it was a very different situation from all these other wars, the ones you talked about this morning, about the Mexican War, Spanish-American, and so forth. This was a civil war in which the very existence of the nation was at stake, which much of the nation at first fully recognized. Now, as the war went on, you got some of the things we talked about this morning.
This is it.
Dr. Miller, the title of your book is The Duty of a Statesman. We don't hear that term statesman applied to our modern political leaders. How would you define statesman, and how has that been lost in our modern political discourse?
The definition I would reject comes from a man I admire, whom you would even call somewhat a statesman, namely Harry Truman, who says a statesman is a dead politician. You can see the point that Truman's making, which has some value, but you need a term to describe the role of somebody who has this collective responsibility of the state and does it well. What is the high moral term for it? We've taken the word politician and made it so negative that it gets the joke that we just got. And in other ways, you can't do much with that. But statesman does carry something of the seriousness of this moral situation. I guess that's the best I can do.
Bill?